Every modern military operation begins in space. The GPS constellation provides navigation. The communication satellites carry encrypted traffic. The intelligence satellites feed the targeting picture. Remove those systems, and the military force depending on them does not become less effective. It becomes degraded. Navigation accuracy of a previous generation, communications bandwidth of a previous generation, intelligence picture latency of a previous generation. The gap between those two states is the gap that the Iranian program had been working to exploit for 12 years. The facility near Karaj was the physical infrastructure of that exploitation, an underground complex in the highlands northwest of Tehran, housing the production infrastructure for a direct-ascent anti-satellite missile system and the high-energy laser assembly line whose output could blind optical sensors on reconnaissance satellites in low Earth orbit. Two weapons categories, one facility, one targeting decision. The direct-ascent anti-satellite missile was the more immediately concerning capability. Direct-ascent weapons destroy satellites by intercepting them on orbit. A kinetic collision that produces a debris field and eliminates the capability of the targeted satellite permanently and publicly. The debris field is the signature. An anti-satellite missile strike on a GPS or communications satellite is an act of war against a national asset that cannot be misattributed. The Iranian program had not conducted such an attack. The threat was its availability, the knowledge that the capability existed and could be employed, and the deterrent effect that knowledge produced on how American military planners considered using the space-based architecture that underpinned their operational concept. A capability held in reserve shapes behavior even when it is not used. The facility near Karaj was producing the weapons that shaped that behavior. The high-energy laser program was the more operationally subtle capability. Laser dazzling and blinding of satellite optical sensors does not destroy the satellite. It degrades, temporarily or permanently, the ability of the sensor to produce useful imagery during the time the laser is illuminating it. Temporary dazzling lasts for seconds to minutes during a satellite pass and produces no observable satellite behavior that would distinguish it from normal sensor operations unless a direct comparison with expected imagery output was available. Permanent blinding, achieved by sustained high-power illumination that bleaches the sensor's photosensitive elements beyond their recovery threshold, is detectable in the satellite's sensor output, but produces no debris, no collision signature, and no irrefutable public attribution. The Iranian program's laser capability, characterized in the target folder as having reached the power levels and pointing precision required for permanent blinding of low Earth orbit imaging sensors in the preceding 9 months, represented the less dramatic but more operationally practical of the two space denial capabilities the facility was producing. You can blind a satellite without being seen to have done it. You cannot launch a kinetic interceptor without every space tracking network on Earth observing the event. The collection program had been technically demanding in a way that differed from any previous target in the series. Space weapons development produces physical evidence. Rocket motors, laser components, test stand signatures, but in a form that is ambiguous without contextual intelligence establishing intent and function. The synthesis that converted ambiguous evidence into confident characterization required 4 years of multi-source technical intelligence work. The result, 94% confidence in the facility's function. 6% was the residual uncertainty that multi-source synthesis retains regardless of thoroughness. The decision was made. The depth was 57 meters in the granite of the Alborz foothills northwest of Tehran, the same geological family as the Parchin mission and the earlier Alborz command node mission, consistent in density with the characterizations those missions had produced, at a depth that required the sequential two-weapon employment that the deepest granite targets in the series had used. The weapons engineers assessed the fusing solution at 85% confidence. 15% was document. The sequential employment required two aircraft. Both weapons had to reach the chambers. Both chambers had to be addressed. The missile production section and the laser assembly section occupied different areas of the facility's layout, separated by 61 meters, each requiring a weapon whose aim point had been computed against its specific position within the facility's mapped subsurface architecture. The two B-2 Spirits lifted off at 9:33 p.m. and 9:41 p.m. The 8-minute departure interval produced the trail separation that the sequential employment's 89-second interval constraint required, a constraint similar in character to the Parchin mission's 93-second constraint, but derived from a different physical mechanism. The laser assembly section housed completed high-energy laser systems in various stages of acceptance testing, and the first weapon's detonation inside the missile production section would transmit seismic energy to the laser assembly area with sufficient amplitude to potentially pre-initiate the optical components in the testing systems, altering the second chamber's structural response to the second weapon in ways the kill mechanism analysis had modeled as requiring a minimum wait time for seismic decay. 89 seconds from first weapon impact to second weapon arrival. The planning had worked the geometry. The trail interval was inside the 89-second window at the coordination checkpoint. The routing required 13 hours and 44 minutes via the northwest approach corridor, the only vector that placed both long-range systems in their least favorable geometry simultaneously, at the cost of transiting airspace whose overflight diplomatic arrangements will not be described. Northwest was the thinnest coverage direction by the design of an Iranian architecture built against its primary threat vectors. Thinner was not absent. The EW package had been built against both conditions simultaneously. The tanker contact at 2:09 a.m. completed in 16 minutes over the northern Arabian Sea. The second contact at 10:51 a.m. east of the Strait placed both aircraft at their final fuel states. The mission commander of the lead aircraft tracked the trail separation throughout the 12-hour flight and noted at the 10-hour coordination checkpoint a 3.7-knot airspeed differential deviation, within tolerance but at its boundary. He made the correction at 10:53 a.m. At the final coordination checkpoint 2 hours later, the differential was within 2 knots of the required value. The correction had been sufficient. The EW package activated at 10:58 a.m. local time, 43 minutes before the planned first initial point. 5 EW elements, the same 5-element architecture from the Mashhad mission, but reconfigured for the northwest approach geometry. The Tehran strategic umbrella's coverage against northwest approaches was provided by S-300 PMU, 2 batteries whose northwest sector sensitivity was lower than their primary coverage sectors, but whose fire control capability, if activated, remained a serious engagement threat. The Growler flights managed the S-300 suppression from the northwest quadrant, the most favorable jamming geometry the Gulf-based Growlers could achieve for a northwest approach mission, with range and angle both within the planning's preferred performance parameters. The Iranian air defense response to the activation was the fastest in the series. The Tehran S-300 batteries began frequency cycling at 38 seconds, 7 seconds faster than the fastest previous response observed across all missions in the series. 38 seconds reflected an elevated readiness posture, whose specific driver the collection had not established, but whose existence the planning had incorporated as a bounding assumption. If the Tehran batteries were at maximum readiness, the response time would be approximately 35 to 40 seconds. The planning had sized the EW package against 35 seconds. The actual response was 38, inside the planning's worst case, bound by 3 seconds. The Growler EW officers followed the first 3 frequency transitions within the modeled response latencies. The 4th transition, at 11:07 a.m., was faster than the preceding 3. The Tehran battery operators had noted the pattern of the Growler response and were attempting to outpace it by accelerating their transition rate. The 4th transition was followed in 9 seconds rather than the 4 to 6 seconds of the earlier transitions. 9 seconds of partial coverage on the S-300's 4th frequency. The partial coverage produced no contact. The Growler EW officer noted the 9-second latency and adjusted his response protocol for subsequent transitions. The inner ring around the Karaj facility consisted of a Tor M1 battery at the facility's surface security compound, an HQ-16 covering the southern and western approach sectors, and a Pantsir S1 that had been positioned at the facility's primary research and development entrance compound, a location the target folder had established from imagery and confirmed from a signals intelligence collection event that had captured the Pantsir's commissioning test emissions 8 months before the mission. At 11:19 a.m., 22 minutes before the first initial point, the HQ-16 medium-range battery activated its fire control radar in a mode that the passive warning receiver characterized as a queued search, not a routine acquisition sweep, but the targeted search mode that a system uses when it has received a contact report from another sensor and is attempting to confirm the track independently. The mission commander checked the collection feed. 31 seconds earlier, at 11:18 a.m. and 29 seconds, a mobile early warning radar vehicle that the target folder had placed at a road junction 6 kilometers south of the facility, a unit the collection had assessed as intermittently operational based on observed emission patterns over the preceding 4 months, had produced a single acquisition pulse on a frequency outside the EW package's allocated suppression bands. Outside the bands because the collection's operational assessment of the unit had led the planning to classify it as low probability active and assign it to the contingency reserve rather than the primary suppression allocation. The mobile radar's single pulse had been on a frequency the EW architecture was not suppressing. It had swept a sector that included the B-2's current position. Whether it had produced a return above threshold was not something the mission commander could determine from the intelligence feed. He could see that the pulse had occurred and that the HQ-16 had activated its fire control radar 31 seconds later, which was consistent with a contact report having been generated and passed up the chain to the HQ-16's engagement controller. He transmitted the contingency allocation code to the EW architecture, tasking the reserve power to the mobile radar's emission frequency. The reserve reached full effectiveness in 11 seconds. The mobile radar produced one more pulse, the last one before the suppression arrived, on the same frequency. The last pulse returned nothing above the noise floor. The contingency allocation had reached the frequency 11 seconds after the first pulse. In those 11 seconds, the mobile radar had emitted once more, found nothing, and been suppressed. The HQ-16's fire control search, cued by whatever the initial pulse had generated, swept the bearing toward the B-2's approach vector twice before the fire control frequency was reached by the EW asset's directed suppression. Both sweeps returned nothing. The HQ-16 downgraded from queued search to routine acquisition at 11:21 a.m. The sector remained at the alert posture the earlier activation pattern had elevated it to. The contingency allocation that had been redirected to the mobile radar's frequency had drawn power from the Pantsir suppression budget, reducing the Pantsir's suppression from its pre-mission allocation level to a partial coverage state that the EW officer managing the inner ring had assessed as adequate but reduced. Adequate but reduced had been the term used in the series to describe suppression levels that prevented weapons quality tracks while not preventing marginal returns. Marginal returns produced reports. Reports produced sector alerts. The mission commander had seen this pattern before. He noted the Pantsir's reduced suppression status and continued toward the initial point. The Pantsir at the Research and Development Entrance Compound produced a search radar return at 11:29 a.m. and 14 seconds. 12 minutes before the first initial point, the return was at 24% detection confidence, below threshold. The operator was operating under the sector's elevated alert posture and was applying the reduced reporting threshold that elevated alert authorized. Any return above 20% warranted reporting under elevated alert protocols. He reported it at 11:29 a.m. and 21 seconds. The sector controller received the report and cross-referenced it with the HQ-16's earlier queued search activation and the mobile radar pulse from 11 minutes earlier. 3 events, a mobile radar pulse, an HQ-16 queued search that found nothing, and a Pantsir 24% return, on a timeline and a bearing consistent with a possible inbound contact. No single event was above threshold. The pattern was consistent. He issued an active sector alert at 11:29 a.m. and 34 seconds. The active sector alert activated all inner ring fire control systems simultaneously. The Tor M1 at the Surface Security Compound activated at 11:29 a.m. and 42 seconds. The HQ-16 reactivated its fire control radar at 11:29 a.m. and 44 seconds. The Pantsir transitioned from search to fire control at 11:29 a.m. and 46 seconds. 3 fire control systems in the inner ring, simultaneously active, 11 minutes and 14 seconds from the first initial point. The EW architecture's response to the simultaneous activation drew from every allocation in the budget simultaneously. The primary Growler allocations on the long-range systems maintained, the inner ring-directed suppression redirected to the activated fire control frequencies, the contingency reserve exhausted on the mobile radar frequency reallocation 11 minutes earlier. The suppression that reached the 3 activated fire control systems was the primary inner ring allocation, not the maximum output that previous missions had redirected from other allocations in response to fire control activations. Primary allocation without contingency reserve meant lower effectiveness than the series had typically maintained against activated fire control radars. 62% on the Tor M1, 58% on the HQ-16, 67% on the Pantsir. None were fully suppressed. All were operating at degraded capability rather than near total degradation. The 3 degraded fire control systems swept the approach sector in the 11 minutes between the alert activation and the first initial point. The Tor M1 produced 2 returns in 11 minutes, one at 29%, one at 31%, both below its autonomous engagement threshold. The HQ-16 produced 3 returns, 22, 26, and 29%, each below threshold, each reported to the sector controller under the elevated alerts reduced reporting standard. The Pantsir produced 4 returns across 6 sweeps, 18, 23, 27, 31, 31, and 29%. A rising then stable pattern through 5 returns that the Pantsir's tracking processor had not crossed into confirmed track status because no single return exceeded 35%. The sector controller was receiving a cascade of below-threshold reports from 3 systems on the same bearing over 11 minutes, below threshold individually. Collectively, he was watching a pattern whose consistency was not characteristic of jamming artifact. Jamming artifacts do not produce 9 returns from 3 systems on the same bearing over 11 minutes with a broadly consistent bearing displacement velocity. He authorized a 2-missile salvo from the HQ-16 on the compiled track at 11:38 a.m. and 52 seconds, 1 minute and 28 seconds before the first initial point. The HQ-16 launched 2 missiles at 11:38 a.m. and 59 seconds on a fire control solution computed from 3 HQ-16 returns at 22, 26, and 29%, supplemented by the sector controller's manually compiled pattern data from the Tor M1 and Pantsir reports. The solution had range ambiguity from the degraded 68% suppression effectiveness and bearing precision enhanced by the compiled multi-system pattern. Better than any single below-threshold system could have provided. Worse than a clean above-threshold engagement would have generated. The mission commander saw the HQ-16 uplink signatures activate at 11:39 a.m., 1 minute and 1 second to the first initial point. He ran the intercept geometry. HQ-16 fire control at 58% effectiveness, range-ambiguous solution, bearing precision enhanced by multi-system compilation, but still below optimal. The solution bracket was wide in range, narrower in bearing than a single system engagement would have produced. The aircraft was inside the bracket. He held course. The initial point was 61 seconds away. Turning would end the mission. He held course. Both missiles detonated at 11:39 a.m. and 47 seconds, 48 seconds after launch. The HQ-16 missiles' time of flight at the range the solution had computed placed the detonation at the near edge of the solution bracket's range ambiguity distribution. The aircraft's actual position was beyond the near edge, at the mid-bracket range, where the range error had placed the fire control computer's computed intercept. Both proximity-fused detonations occurred short of the aircraft's actual position, short by the specific amount that the range ambiguity had introduced between the computed intercept and the actual aircraft. The pressure signatures reached the airframe at 11:39 a.m. and 51 seconds. Near miss, mission continuing. 14 seconds to the first initial point. The first initial point was at 11:40 a.m. and 5 seconds. The bay doors open. The GPS solution was confirmed against the missile production section's subsurface coordinate at 57 meters in the Alborz granite. The first GBU-57 released. The aircraft corrected and turned toward the second aim point. Bay doors closed. The weapon's penetration through the granite proceeded without anomaly. Dense, uniform, predictable. The Alborz foothills granite performing consistently with the earlier characterizations from the Alborz command node and Parchin missions. The fusing algorithm ran its standard granite sequence. The fuse threshold was met at 54 meters, 3 meters above the design detonation depth, at the lower edge of the confidence interval. 3 meters above design in dense granite transmitted overpressure to the missile production section's chambers through the intact rock cap with the efficiency that dense rock provides, lower than direct contact geometry, sufficient for the equipment specification range that the intelligence characterization had established. The missile production sections completed anti-satellite interceptors, the propulsion stages in final assembly, the guidance system integration stations, all experienced the transmitted overpressure at 11:40 a.m. and 52 seconds. The trail aircraft's initial point was at 11:41 a.m. and 34 seconds, 89 seconds after the first weapon's surface impact. At the boundary of the seismic clearance window, the laser assembly section's optical component pre-initiation risk had required. The second GBU-57 released from the trail aircraft's forward station and followed the approach to the laser assembly section's aim point, the coordinate 61 meters from the first aim point at 49 meters depth. 49 meters reflected the laser assembly section's position in a part of the facility that had been excavated from a different access shaft, using a shallower construction approach that the engineering had permitted when the geology transitioned from granite to a softer felsite intrusion above the assembly section's position. Felsite is harder than most sedimentary rocks and softer than granite. The fusing algorithm had been developed against the felsite density profile from the Geological Survey. The detonation at 47 meters, 2 meters above the design depth in the felsite formation, placed the explosive yield inside the laser assembly section's chamber at the geometry. The kill mechanism analysis had established as effective at the median equipment specification. The high-energy laser systems in various stages of acceptance testing, the optical bench assemblies, the beam control and pointing systems, the detector arrays, all eliminated at 11:41 a.m. and 52 seconds. The two seismic events that the Tehran Metropolitan Seismic Monitoring Network recorded at 11:40 a.m. and 11:41 a.m., 58 seconds apart at coordinates northwest of the capital, were characterized by the duty seismologist as anomalous within 4 minutes of the second event. He filed his report at 11:46 a.m. The Karaj facility's security monitoring system had registered simultaneous contact loss with both chambers at 11:40 a.m. and 52 seconds. The duty security officer attempted contact on primary and backup channels. Both returned silence. He activated the emergency protocol at 11:43 a.m. and notified the facility security commander. The facility security commander, monitoring an active sector alert, 2 HQ-16 missiles whose intercept status was unconfirmed, and now a facility contact loss, transmitted his situation report to the IRGC Command Authority at 11:49 a.m. Both B-2s were 160 miles into their egress headings. The numbers: 13 hours and 44 minutes of flight time, 2 GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrators in an 89-second interval from 2 aircraft on separate aim points, mobile radar pulse outside primary EW allocation, 11 seconds to contingency suppression, second pulse found nothing, contingency reserve exhaustion reducing Pantsir suppression to 67%, producing the 24% return triggering the sector alert. 9 below threshold returns from 3 systems in 11 minutes, manually fused by the sector controller into a 2-missile HQ-16 salvo. Detonation short by the range ambiguity margin. 14 seconds between detonation and initial point. First weapon at 54 meters, 3 above design, effective at median specification. Second weapon at 47 meters in felsite, 2 above design, effective. 0 aircraft lost. Both sections eliminated. The space denial capabilities ceased to exist as a production program at 11:41 a.m. A weapon that threatens space-based infrastructure does not need to destroy satellites to reshape the calculus of those who depend on them. It needs only to exist. Remove the weapon and the calculus returns to its prior state. The facility near Karaj existed to perpetuate the threat. The facility no longer exists. The granite holds the fractures. The space above it is unchanged. What was being built to reach that space no longer has a production line.